when we think about the First World War, it's whitewashed. Hundreds of thousands of black men, women and children were caught up in that war on this country's behalf.
Remembrance Day, an occasion steeped in history all across the United Kingdom. Chances are you'll be able to find a memorial to the soldiers that gave their lives fighting in that conflict. But not so the case in Africa, where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of black men, women and children made a contribution to Britain's war effort against Germany in the First World War. David Lammy's been to East Africa. He's seen sites, mass graves, where those people who gave their lives are buried. And he's campaigning now for those men, women and children to receive the same recognition and commemoration as their white counterparts.
The first shots and the last shots in the First World War were not fired in Europe, they were fired in Africa. Hundreds of thousands of black men, women and children were caught up in that war on this country's behalf. They were poor black folk who were called carriers or porters. They carried equipment and bedding and provisions right across East Africa for the British. And then there were also something called a group of soldiers called the Askari, who were tremendous soldiers from across Africa who were considered very fierce, very, very good soldiers who also died battling in the First World War on the African continent. I knew nothing about their contribution, not one jot. One of the things that came out of the First World War that you might remember learning in school is that because there were so many casualties on the Western Front particularly, there was this powerful notion of equality, that whether you were a sort of normal foot soldier or a corporal or lieutenant, you were sort of buried alongside each other. Mm-hmm. And actually after the First World War, sort of that notion of equality for working class people really grew. In fact, it birthed the Labour Party, which came to power just a few years later in 1923. Well, that equality did not extend to black folk. It's not just the contribution of Africans that was whitewashed, that has been forgotten, erased, but also the dignity afforded people in death.
So tell me more about this trip to Africa then. What were the things you learnt, maybe the key contributions from soldiers in that theatre of conflict, the mass graves that you visited? Tell me about it.
There are these amazing cemeteries in Kenya and Tanzania that are kept by the War Graves Commission, that are beautifully kept, but unfortunately the Africans were not buried there. There was effectively an apartheid. You tend to think of eugenics, which obviously became a big thing in the 1920s and was picked up by Hitler, but actually the ideas behind the difference between people who were white and people who were black had started long before that. And I'm afraid people like Churchill, who was the secretary responsible for the War Graves Commission as it was set up, also goes along this line that you can allow cemeteries to revert to nature, as they call it, which is basically just to turn back into bush. That is how the black Africans were treated.
There's almost collective amnesia about the East Africa campaign, Britain's role in essentially codifying and inventing scientific racism, Churchill's very difficult racist past. Do you think it's a sense of shame in this country about where we've come from, or do you think it's a deliberate attempt to not remember?
I think it's a determination to embolden myths. Myths are important to all societies, and we only learn from our history and don't repeat the mistakes of the past if we confess up to our history. Churchill remains, in many ways, a hero for his stand during the Second World War. But that doesn't mean that we can't understand critically his contribution in the First World War, and certainly his contribution to erasing the story and contribution of black Africans.
In terms of today, Do you think the UK is still a racist country?
I think that Britain struggles with racism. Of course it does. I see it in my job all the time. Now, I have seen improvements over my lifetime. We have to recognise that sometimes racism is institutional. It's sanctioned. It comes from the state and big organisations and can exist in big organisations. And I'm afraid this is a story of a loved organisation, for very good reasons, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, that has struggled with that prejudice.
A memorial to the men and women from Africa and the Caribbean, 100 years since, and it's still not personal, is it?
Yeah, I think that this is important to have because it does recognise the contribution, particularly of Caribbean and Commonwealth soldiers. But what this doesn't achieve is the full understanding of the contribution of African soldiers. 100 years later, I think there is more that we could do and must do.